We're about to begin a brand new love journey. Please comment on where you're watching from so we can see that our Soul Stories family is all around the world. The desert wind swept fiercely through the rows of dry corn, carrying the scent of earth in Arizona's burning sun. A sleek black Range Rover rolled slowly along the dusty red road, stopping in front of a rusted sign that faintly read Whitmore Farm. Eric Hale lowered the car window, sunlight cutting across his chiseled face. The same man Forbes once called the empire builder from ashes. At 36, he owned dozens of properties across the United States. Skyscrapers in Chicago, New York, Dallas. Yet this place, the abandoned land his father had left behind, was the only thing that made him hesitate. He had come only to sign a few papers, reassess the property's value, and sell it off. A rundown farm in the desert wasn't worth his time, but as the car turned down the dirt path toward the land, what he saw made him slam the brakes. In the middle of the withered cornfield, a woman was working under the blazing sun. Her dark blonde hair was tied back loosely, a few messy strands clinging to her neck. Her olive work dress was streaked with mud, the back soaked in sweat. Every movement she made was slow and steady, as if she were a part of the land itself. Eric stepped out of the car, his Italian leather shoes immediately sinking into the sticky soil. He frowned, but his gaze stayed locked on the woman. A strange wave of familiarity washed over him. When she straightened up and lifted the brim of her straw hat, the sunlight hit her face, and his heart froze. "Clara!" he breathed, his voice hoarse against the wind. She turned. Her hazel eyes met his without a flicker of fear. There was only a brief moment of surprise before calm acceptance, as if she had known he would come. "Eric Hale," she said, her tone low and even, yet it pierced him clean through. "Didn't think you still remembered the way home." He took a few steps closer, his throat dry. "I didn't think you were still here." "Who did you think planted all this corn?" Clara bent to pick up a dropped glove, brushing off the dirt. "Everyone else left. Only a fool like me stayed behind." Eric opened his mouth to speak, but his eyes caught something under the shade of an old sycamore tree nearby. 3 children sat there, sorting corn into a wooden crate. Barefoot, their skins sun-kissed, their pale hair glowing like threads of sunlight. They laughed, their voices bright and carefree. And when they looked up, their eyes, gray-blue, clear and cold as a dawn lake, made his blood run still. There was no mistaking it. Those eyes were his. He heard himself speak, the words bursting out like a curse from deep within. "Don't tell me. They're mine?" Clara stood motionless as the wind tossed strands of hair across her face. 1 second, 2. Then she looked straight at him, unflinching, fearless. Only the quiet weariness of someone who had endured too much. "You know the answer better than anyone." The world around Eric seemed to go silent. The wind still blew, the leaves still rustled, yet every sound felt sucked away. He stared at the 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, maybe 4 years old, identical enough to be mirror images of the same smile he once had. "No, no, that's impossible." He took a step back, his voice breaking. You couldn't have. Clara, You left 4 years ago," she cut him off coldly. "No calls, no letters, no looking back. What did you expect? That I'd wait here forever, clutching that emptiness?" Eric clenched his fists. He remembered that day, leaving Arizona with nothing but a suitcase and an illusion of success. He'd promised to return, but then came the contracts, the figures, the endless nights of champagne and deals, and that promise turned to ash. Now standing before her, every excuse felt worthless. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know you had children." Clara's smile was faint, but joyless. "No, you didn't. And maybe you never wanted to." The children had stopped playing and were staring at him. One little girl, the eldest perhaps, tugged on her mother's dress and asked softly, "Mommy, who's that man?" Clara bent down, her hand gently resting on her daughter's shoulder. "Just someone who lost his way, sweetheart." Eric's chest tightened. In that moment, he truly felt like a man who had lost his way, in every sense. A gust of wind swept through, kicking up dust. Clara's straw hat flew from her hand, and instinctively he stepped forward to catch it. When he handed it back, their eyes met again, close enough for him to hear the erratic rhythm of his own heartbeat. "Clara," he murmured, "you shouldn't have to face all this alone." She took the hat, her tone calm and steady. "I'm not alone. I live, and these three little ones are proof of that." Eric looked down at the soil she'd been working damp, hard, filled with dry roots. A land that seemed barren, yet somehow under her hands life still grew. "I signed the divorce papers," she continued, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Sent them through the lawyer. I don't blame you, but you don't get to walk in here and reclaim what you once threw away." Eric lifted his gaze, the sunlight stinging his eyes. "I didn't come to reclaim anything. I just don't know how to begin." Clara pressed her lips together, silent for a moment. Then she bent down and picked up the metal pail beside her. "Then start by leaving my farm." Eric froze. She turned and walked away, her small frame steady and resolute among the tall golden corn. The three children ran after her, hand in hand, hair flying in the wind. The late afternoon sun spilled across the fields, bathing everything in gold. Eric stood there, his black shoes caked in dirt, his white shirt streaked with dust. The image of that woman blurred in the amber light. Yet his heart, for the first time in years, beat not with reason, but with a burning ache. He whispered, as if confessing to himself, "Clara Whitmore, I lost you once. Maybe God brought me back just so I could see everything I let slip away." And as night slowly draped over the fields, Eric Hale, the man who once thought he owned the world, finally understood that he had just found the one thing he could never be rich enough to buy back: family. Afternoons in the Arizona desert always carry the faint scent of burnt grass mixed with the sweetness of corn and dry earth. When Eric returned to the farm at sunset the next day, he still didn't know what he was looking for. An explanation, perhaps, or simply the courage to face his own mistakes. The wooden gate creaked open. In the yard, Clara was rinsing garden tools at an old water basin. The three children were playing around a puddle of mud, their laughter echoing through the still air. That sound, bright and pure, made Eric stop in his tracks. Something achingly familiar stirred inside him, something he had never once heard in his glass-walled penthouse in Manhattan. "You're still here?" Clara asked without looking up. Her voice wasn't cold, just tired, like rain that hadn't fallen in years and wasn't exactly welcome anymore. "I need to talk," Eric said, stepping closer. The evening light fell across his shoulders, casting a long shadow on the ground. "I just want the truth. You said they're my children, but She lifted her head, her gaze sharp as a blade. "You doubt it?" Eric swallowed, his hands tightening in his pockets. "I just want to be sure. Everything happened so suddenly." Clara dried her hands on a worn cloth, then walked toward him. In the fading light, her brown eyes reflected both the sky and a sorrow carved into stone. "Sudden," she said quietly. "You left without a word, Eric. You never asked how I was, if I was even alive, and now you come back surprised that life dared to go on without you." "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. "I had to leave." "I had to choose between love and money?" She cut in. "You chose money, Eric." "I understood that a long time ago." Silence fell between them. Only the first chorus of crickets broke the air. Then Clara sighed and reached into her apron, pulling out a small, crumpled envelope, yellowed and creased with time. "I suppose you still recognize your own handwriting." Eric took it, his hand trembling as he touched the fragile paper. The scrawled words on the front hit him like a ghost from another life. "To Clara, if I'm brave enough someday." He tore open the seal, each word slicing deeper into his memory. "Clara, if you're reading this letter, it means I wasn't brave enough to tell you this while I was still there. I was afraid you'd see me for what I am, a man unworthy of the love you've given me. I wanted to give you a better life, but the closer I was to you, the smaller I felt. So I chose to leave, to fight my battles out there until I became someone strong enough to deserve you. If one day I return, please don't hate me." Eric couldn't read further. His hands shook. How did you get this? I don't remember ever sending." You never did, Clara said softly, her voice as quiet as sand slipping through fingers. I found it in your old drawer, with the divorce papers your lawyer mailed over. He looked up. Her eyes no longer held anger, only emptiness. You planned to walk away and forget everything, didn't you? Pretend I never existed? Eric drew a shaky breath. I meant to come back, Clara. But then the first project took off. People started calling me a legend. And I got scared. Scared that if I came back, I'd find you happy without me. Clara let out a short laugh, the kind that hurt to hear. While you were scared of my happiness, I was fighting to survive, paying hospital bills, giving birth to 3 babies in a small-town clinic. No husband, no help. Just me and those tiny hearts. You feared seeing me happy, Eric, but it never once crossed your mind that I might not even live through it, did it? Eric took a step back. It felt like walking on the rubble of his own past. You should have told me. One phone call, Clara. I did call, she said, her tone suddenly firm, but you changed your number. I wrote letters too. They came back unopened. The day I received the last one, the stamp was still clean and new. I sat on the porch watching the sun go down, and I understood. People only lose their way when they're headed somewhere else. She turned slightly, the wind tossing strands of hair around her face. I didn't keep your letter out of hope. I kept it to remind myself that once I was loved, even if it was only in words you never sent. Eric clenched the paper, the ink-stained lines smudging beneath his fingers. It felt like ashes, fragile and final. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but then he saw the children running toward them from the field. Cheeks flushed, laughter bright beneath the fading sun. Mommy! Look! The little girl held up a bouquet of wildflowers, beaming with pride. Clara bent down, her voice softening. Beautiful, sweetheart. Take one to your brother and sister. Eric stood there frozen. 3 small faces, all carrying pieces of him. The same innocent smiles, the same gray-blue eyes. Eyes that carried a light he had long lost within himself. He didn't know what to call the feeling rising in him. Regret, grief, or the quiet horror of realizing that his past hadn't stayed buried. It was right here, alive, laughing, breathing before him. Clara rose, lifting the smallest child into her arms. You see, Eric, she said without looking at him, your past is still breathing. And it doesn't need you to survive. The word struck him, gentle as wind, sharp as a knife. Eric stepped back, staring at the deep crimson sky. He had once believed success meant standing above everything, but now all he could feel was the fall, not from a building, but from the high tower of his own pride. Clara, he said hoarsely, I don't know how to fix this. It's not my job to teach you, she replied quietly, her gaze fixed on the 3 children laughing together. I just need you to understand. Here, love isn't a promise. It's those tiny hands growing stronger every day. Eric nodded faintly, but his throat was tight, words trapped behind the weight of shame. As Clara turned away, holding the children's hands, their figures grew smaller against the golden cornfields. And he understood that the only thing he could do now was stay in silence and learn from the beginning how to be a man. A soft breeze drifted by, carrying a few petals of wildflowers to his feet. Eric sat down slowly, looking at the letter in his hands. The letter he never sent, now turned into the final verdict on his heart. For the first time in years, billionaire Eric Hale wasn't thinking about contracts, shares, or wealth. He thought only of a woman under the desert sun and 3 children with his eyes, and wondered if it was already too late to find his way home. Night fell over the Arizona desert faster than Eric remembered. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when the last streaks of red light were swallowed by the dark. He sat motionless in his car, parked beside the old wooden fence, staring through the windshield at Clara's small house. A faint yellow glow shone from her window. Soft, warm, heartbreakingly peaceful. He wondered why something so simple could unsettle him more than any multi-million-dollar meeting he'd ever faced in Manhattan. Maybe because there, life was only numbers and profit margins, while here, One breath from her was enough to remind him how much he had lost. As the wind picked up, Eric leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes, and the past came rushing back like a reel of film playing in reverse. 4 years ago, he had been nothing more than a struggling young investor, desperate to be noticed. The New York project was his golden ticket, and he believed that once he signed that deal, he could finally give Clara the life she deserved. He remembered the morning he left. Clara stood by the door smiling, gentle, trusting, the way she always did. "Go, Eric," she'd said softly. "I know you'll make it." He'd held her close, pressed a hurried kiss to her forehead, and whispered the promise he'd come to hate most. "I'll be back before autumn ends." But that autumn came and went, and so did winter, spring, and another summer. He never returned. Instead, he threw himself into work like a man possessed. New York never slept, and neither did he. He ran from the fear of not being enough, from the memory of a woman waiting in a small farmhouse with flour on her hands, from the thought that maybe he wasn't worthy of something as simple as being loved. One late night, after signing his first big contract, Eric took out his phone, ready to call her. But when the screen flashed no service, he let out a bitter laugh. It wasn't the lack of signal. It was the realization that they now lived in different worlds. From that night on, he stopped calling, and somewhere along the way, Clara must have stopped waiting. As for Clara, Eric never truly knew what she went through after he left. Not long after his departure, she discovered she was pregnant. Not with one child, but 3. The doctor had frowned, warning her, "It's a high-risk pregnancy. You'll need rest," but rest meant nothing when her savings barely covered the water bill. She stayed at the farm, the crooked house with the leaking roof and the wind howling through the cracks. With her bare hands, she repaired, cleaned, and planted the first rows of corn as the rain season began. On sleepless nights, Clara would sit on the porch, listening to the insects sing, speaking softly to the tiny lives inside her. "Your father is probably far away," she'd whisper, "but I promise I'll give you a home." Then came the day of birth, a small-town hospital, no family, no one to hold her hand. The pain stretched on for 14 hours, and when the last cry filled the room, she barely managed a weak smile before fainting. She had thought about writing to him, to tell him, but every time she picked up the pen, she stopped. If he wanted to know, he would have been here. Eric opened his eyes. Through the windshield, the lights in Clara's house had dimmed, except for the faint glow in the children's room. He imagined her sitting there, reading them a bedtime story, her voice so gentle even the desert wind would pause to listen. He started the engine and drove aimlessly down the dirt road. For some reason, his foot pressed softer on the pedal than usual, as if afraid of disturbing the quiet night. About 20 minutes later, he stopped at a roadside motel, the kind he'd once looked down on. The room was small, with a single bed and water stains crawling down the walls. When he picked up the key, he barely noticed the clerk's skeptical look. A billionaire in a dust-streaked shirt, looking more like an unemployed drifter than the founder of Hale Developments. He dropped his suitcase on the bed, took off his watch, and sat by the small wooden desk. The dim yellow light fell over his reflection in the mirror. Tired, older, hollow. He reached for his wallet, searching without really knowing what for. Between credit cards, business cards, and flight receipts, he found a small, worn photograph. Edges frayed from years of being forgotten. In the photo, Clara was laughing, her hair caught in the wind, his arms wrapped around her from behind. They were standing on a beach, the day he'd promised to buy her a little house by the shore. He stared at it for a long time before a dry, humorless laugh escaped his throat. Everything he had built, the towers, the companies, the name, felt utterly meaningless compared to that single moment frozen in time. He murmured under his breath, "I had everything, except the only thing that ever mattered." After selling Hale Developments, Eric had founded his own investment firm in New York. The more he earned, the emptier he felt. Now sitting in the middle of the Arizona desert, he realized he could buy an entire town, but not the peace in his heart. He dropped his head into his hands. For the first time in years, he was afraid, not of losing money, but of losing the one chance left to make things right. Outside, the wind swept across the desert, carrying with it the scent of dust and cold. He knew there was only one way to silence the storm inside him: to go back and face the woman he'd left behind in the sunlight. But how do you begin when every apology is too late? Near midnight, Eric was still awake. He turned on his phone, scrolling mindlessly until his finger stopped at the photo he'd taken earlier. 3 small children playing in the yard, their faces bright, innocent, radiant, each carrying a fragment of him. He smiled faintly, a weary but genuine smile. Maybe tomorrow he would return, not to explain, not to beg, but simply to help her mend that old fence. Maybe then she wouldn't send him away again. Eric lifted his gaze to the fogged window. The desert outside was silent, yet in that silence he could hear something. The steady, quiet beat of his heart. The one he thought had long gone still was now pulsing again, slow and sure, as if reminding him. No one is truly lost, as long as they still have the courage to come home. The desert sun rose early that morning, spreading golden light across rows of corn still damp with dew. The air carried the scent of dry grass and freshly turned soil. In the distance came the faint creak of wagon wheels and the crow of a rooster. Clara was bent over, tying the loose section of the fence, when she heard a car stop at the gate. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Only Eric Hale would drive a sleek black Range Rover down this dusty red road, like a drop of ink fallen onto rough paper. "What are you doing back here?" she asked evenly, neither cold nor welcoming. Eric stepped out of the car, holding nothing but a hammer and a coil of wire he'd clearly picked up in town. He looked completely different from the day before. The crisp dress shirt replaced by a soft gray t-shirt, jeans worn at the knees, and shoes already covered in dust. "I heard the south fence collapsed in the wind," he said simply. "I came to fix it." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Billionaire Eric Hale knows how to fix fences?" He just smiled faintly, not answering, and walked to where the posts leaned askew. He started to work, clumsily and awkwardly, dropping the hammer twice, bending a few nails and scraping his hand on the wood. Clara watched, equal parts irritated and amused. "You've never done a day of physical work in your life, have you?" Eric wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting at her. "I have," he said quietly. "I just forgot how." The simple honesty in his voice made her pause. For the first time in years, she heard no arrogance, no excuses, only humility. She didn't reply. Instead, she stepped forward, took the hammer from his hand, and demonstrated. "Like this," she said, driving a nail in with sure, steady rhythm. "Hold it firm so the post won't sway when the wind comes." He watched carefully, then mimicked her movements. At first awkward, but soon the rhythm of their hammers fell into sync. Steady, familiar, like two people who had once worked together long ago. From across the field came the sound of laughter. 3 small figures ran toward them. "Mommy! Who's that?" one of the children called out. Before Clara could answer, Eric crouched down, smiling. "My name's Eric, but you can call me Mr. Eric, all right?" The kids looked at one another, then shouted in unison, "Mr. Eric!" Their laughter filled the air. Eric chuckled, a real warm sound that reached his eyes. Clara stood back, her heart tightening unexpectedly. He hadn't looked that natural, that unguarded, even back when they were still married. As the sun climbed higher, they kept working side by side. Mud streaked their pants, sweat dampened their collars. Clara was just about to tell him to take a break when, lifting one of the heavier beams, Eric lost his footing. He slipped into the shallow ditch with a loud splash, mud flying everywhere. For a heartbeat, everything went silent, and then the children's laughter exploded through the air. Clara tried to keep a straight face, but when Eric sat up, covered in dirt like a scolded schoolboy, she couldn't help it. A bright, unrestrained laugh burst out. Eric looked up at her, smiling through the mud. Her laughter, real, ringing, unguarded, lit up the whole field. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard that sound. It made every ounce of guilt in his chest soften. "I think you just won a battle," he said, wiping at his cheek. "Yeah," she said between giggles. "The first one I've ever won without arguing. And the second? The second is you cleaning all that mud off my porch when you go inside." He nodded solemnly and they both laughed again. Light, easy, the kind of laughter that carried forgiveness in it. After lunch, Clara brewed coffee while Eric sat on the porch steps, and the three children gathered around him. The middle boy leaned forward eagerly. "Mr. Eric, where do you work?" "In the city," Eric replied, "in tall buildings." "Taller than that hill?" "Much taller." "Do you like it there?" the eldest asked, tilting her head. Eric hesitated, then gave a small, wistful smile. "Not as much as I like it here." Clara, overhearing from the kitchen, looked up. The simple words stirred something inside her. For years, her life had been about survival, about keeping food on the table and the lights on. She had forgotten what it felt like to have someone simply be there, listening to her children's laughter. Watching Eric surrounded by them, she felt an unfamiliar ache, a kind of peace that frightened her. As the sun dipped lower, they washed their hands together by the old outdoor basin. Eric held out a towel for her, but when their hands brushed, the brief touch of warmth made both of them freeze. "Clara," he said softly, "I know I've done too many things wrong, but let me stay a few more days. To help, not to make up for anything." She looked at him, her eyes conflicted. Part of her wanted to say no, to protect herself from reopening wounds that had barely healed. But another part, the part that still remembered how he used to hold her hand under the stars, whispered that maybe, just maybe, he meant it this time. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but only for a few days. And you'll work, not just talk." Eric smiled. "I promise." That evening, they cleaned out the old horse stable together. The sun melted into amber light, and the hum of insects filled the air. Eric watched Clara in the fading glow, her hair damp with sweat, a few strands sticking to her cheek, her eyes steady and alive. He realized something then. She hadn't been broken by what happened. She had simply stopped waiting for him, and somehow that realization both hurt and humbled him. When they finished, the new fence stood straight and sturdy. For the first time in years, Eric felt a quiet pride, the kind that came not from success or wealth, but from honest effort. "Thank you," Clara said, wiping a smudge of dirt from her face. "You didn't ruin anything today." "Not entirely," he said, half joking, half sincere. "I think I just lost a very expensive pair of shoes." "They don't belong on this soil anyway," she replied. "Maybe neither do I," he murmured, his voice low. But his gaze never left hers. Clara said nothing. She didn't agree, but she didn't deny it either. She simply turned and called the children in for dinner. Eric stood there, watching as they disappeared behind the wooden door. And for the first time in years, something deep within him stirred. The quiet, aching sense that after all his years of running, he had finally set foot on the only ground that ever mattered. Under the violet-pink sky of the Arizona dusk, he whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, "Tomorrow I'll come back." And this time, not to fix a fence, but to mend the heart he once abandoned. The first gust of wind swept across the desert that afternoon. Within minutes, the Arizona sky shifted, from pale blue to gunmetal gray, then to a heavy, bruised black. Clouds rolled together like waves preparing to crash, and the air thickened with that unmistakable scent of metal and moisture, the smell that warned of a real storm. Clara lifted her head from the cornrows, sweat still glistening on her temple. "It's going to be a big one," she murmured, half to the wind, half to herself. In the distance, Eric was still at work by the south fence, his shirt plastered to his skin, hammer gripped tight in one hand. She opened her mouth to call out to him, but before she could, thunder cracked across the sky like a rifle shot. "Grace! Ellie! Sam! Inside, now!" Clara shouted, her voice nearly lost in the rising howl of wind. The three children dropped what they were doing and ran, squealing as the first drops of rain hit their faces. Clara turned back toward the field, just in time to see Eric glance toward the horse stable. "Clara!" he yelled over the wind. "The roof's not secured. If the gusts pick up, it'll collapse." "Eric, don't—" It's too late. But he was already running, head bent against the rain, as if something deep inside him refused to watch destruction happen without fighting it. The storm came all at once. The wind roared like a living thing, hurling sand and debris through the air. Rain fell in sheets, drenching the ground in seconds. Eric fought to keep his footing as he reached the stable. The world around him reduced to water and noise. He gripped the loose beam, trying to tie the rope around it, but his hands were slick with mud. The rain stung his face like shards of glass. He could barely see. The roof above him groaned, threatening to tear away completely. "Eric!" Clara's voice cut through the chaos. He turned. She was running toward him, soaked through, the yellow slicker whipping around her in the wind. "Are you out of your mind?" she shouted, pushing through the doorway. "The horses are panicking," he yelled back. "If the door gives way, they'll break loose and get hurt." Together they grabbed the heavy wooden door, forcing it shut against the wind. The latch slipped once, twice before Eric jammed the bar through. Water splashed up to their knees, their breath coming fast, hearts pounding in the same uneven rhythm as the thunder above them. When the door finally held, they both stumbled backward, collapsing onto the wet straw. The rain roared against the tin roof, drowning out everything else. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Clara sat opposite him, breathing hard, eyes half closed. Her hair clung to her cheeks, her clothes plastered to her skin. Yet even in exhaustion, she radiated something unyielding, a quiet strength that shamed him more than any accusation could. Eric watched her, his pulse still hammering. For years he had told himself she'd been too fragile to understand the world he lived in. But looking at her now, steady, grounded, alive, he realized she had never been the fragile one. He had. Outside, the storm began to ebb. The furious wind gave way to a steady drizzle, soft and rhythmic, like the sound of a heartbeat returning after a long silence. "Are the kids safe?" he asked at last, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded, hugging her knees. "They're inside, probably watching through the window, worrying about us." "Good," he said, staring at the puddle forming between them. "You shouldn't have come out here." "Neither should you." He almost smiled. "I guess we're both terrible at listening." Clara leaned back against the stable wall, exhaling slowly. "I forgot what storms feel like," she murmured. "When you're alone, you just wait for them to end. But when someone else is there, even if it's a fool doing something reckless," her voice softened, "it doesn't feel so endless." Eric looked at her, really looked. For the first time in years, there was no distance between them, just the smell of wet straw, the quiet dripping from the roof, and the fragile calm that comes right after chaos. "Clara," he said quietly, "I should have been here for all of it. The storms, the repairs, the nights like this." She didn't look at him. "You weren't." "I know." His throat tightened. "I thought I was doing the right thing. Building something, making something of myself. I thought if I came back successful, you'd be proud." Clara gave a tired laugh. Not cruel, just sad. "You wanted me proud of your buildings, when all I wanted was for you to come home." The words hit him like the echo of thunder, long after the sky had quieted. He lowered his gaze, ashamed. "I don't know how to ask for forgiveness. I don't think I deserve it." Clara turned her head, studying him. "It's not about deserving, Eric. It's about understanding. You left because you thought love was something to earn, but it isn't. It's something you choose, again and again, even when the wind howls." He swallowed hard, her words sinking deeper than the rain ever could. They sat in silence after that, a silence not heavy, but human. Outside, the rain thinned into mist, the air cooler, cleaner. Through the small crack in the stable door, a sliver of gray light appeared, soft as morning. Eric stood slowly and extended a hand to her. "Come on, let's check on them." Clara hesitated, then placed her muddy hand in his. He pulled her up, their palms slipping slightly, but neither let go. When they stepped outside, the storm had passed. The sky still trembled with distant thunder, but the desert smelled of new beginnings, earth reborn under rain. The farmhouse stood intact, its porch lights flickering in the wind. At the window, 3 small faces pressed against the glass, eyes wide with relief. When they saw their mother, they waved wildly, and she waved back. Her laughter carried faintly across the wet field. Eric stood beside her, watching. He felt the ache in his shoulders, the sting in his palms, but beneath it all, something unfamiliar. Peace. "I used to hate storms," he said softly. "Now I think maybe I needed one." Clara turned to him. "Why?" because it blew away everything that didn't matter. His eyes met hers and left me standing right where I should have been all along. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind shifted, cool and tender. She could still see the man who once left her, but she also saw the one who came back, willing to stand in the rain beside her, no longer above the world, but within it. She nodded toward the house. "Come on, Mr. Hale. You've earned some coffee." He smiled faintly. "Only if you make it the way you used to. Too sweet." "Still stubborn," she said, shaking her head as they started walking. "Still here," he replied. And as they crossed the muddy field toward the warm light of the farmhouse, Eric Hale realized something he'd never learned in all his years of building empires. Sometimes it takes a storm to rebuild what the sun has long forgotten. The morning sun rose slowly, as if it too was weary after a long night of storms. The last drops of rain clung to the corn leaves, glimmering like crystal. The heavy, restless air of yesterday had lifted, replaced by the scent of damp soil and the clean, cool breath of wind. Clara opened the window and looked out at the fields. Everything was a mess. Mud splattered across the yard, the chicken coop half collapsed, the fence broken, the well overflowing with silt. Yet amid the chaos there was a strange calm, because for the first time in years, she wasn't facing it alone. Eric was there. He wore no vest, no watch, no sign of the man who once ruled glass towers. Just bare hands, a gray t-shirt streaked with dirt, and a quiet focus that didn't belong to the Eric Hale she remembered. He was cleaning out the chicken coop, sweat running down his back. Each time he lifted a shovel of straw, he paused to make sure the chicks weren't frightened. "What are you doing?" Clara called out from the porch. He turned, smiled faintly. "Cleaning up after last night's hero." "What hero?" "The one who almost got kicked by a horse, struck by lightning, and attacked by chickens." Clara couldn't help it. She laughed, that bright, surprised laugh that made her eyes shine. "How long do you plan to keep this up?" "As long as it takes," he said, "to prove I can do more than sign contracts." She didn't answer, but her gaze softened. Maybe because, for the first time, he wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't promising redemption. He was simply working. Slow, steady, quietly mending the things he had once broken. By noon, when the sun had burned through the mist, Eric moved to the old well. He took off his shirt, rolled up his sleeves, and leaned over the edge to pull the rope. The pulley was rusted, the bucket tangled, the water cloudy. Patiently, he untied each knot, replaced the rope, and cleaned the rim. The sound of dripping water mixed with the chirping of sparrows, a small, ordinary music he hadn't heard in Manhattan's silence of steel and glass. The children ran out of the house, barefoot and laughing. Grace, the eldest, carried a small basket of seeds. "Mommy said we can start planting again, but we want Mr. Eric to help." Eric crouched down to their level, smiling. "All right, but you three are the bosses." The kids cheered. They chose a sunny patch of ground on the east side of the yard, where Clara's flower garden used to be, now only bare soil. Eric dug the earth while the children sprinkled seeds, giggling every time dirt stuck to their cheeks. "We have to name each row," Grace said seriously, "like in Mommy's stories." Eric wiped his forehead, amused. "Okay, what are we calling them?" "This one," Grace pointed to the first, "is lavender, because Mommy says lavender smells like peace." "This one's hope," Ellie chimed in, throwing a handful of seeds. Then little Sam, the youngest, looked thoughtful before saying with quiet conviction, "And this one's home, because I want this place to be home." Eric froze. That single word, home, hit something deep inside him, something that twisted and ached all at once. He set his hand gently on the soil. "Lavender, hope, home," he repeated softly, almost like a vow. From the porch, Clara stood watching them. The sight made her breath catch. The man who had once walked away, now kneeling in the dirt beside three children, his hands stained with earth, sunlight dancing on their faces. Somehow the brokenness between them didn't look so impossible anymore. By late afternoon, the little garden had taken shape. 3 neat rows of soil, each marked with small wooden stakes. Eric carved the names himself, uneven letters but written with care. Lavender, hope, home. He stood back, gazing at them with quiet pride. "I think," he said softly, This might be the most important contract I've ever signed. Grace looked up curiously. What's a contract, Mr. Eric? It's a promise grown-ups write down, he explained, so they don't forget what they said. Do you keep your promises, she asked. Eric met her gaze for a long moment, his throat tight. This time, he said, I will. Later, as the sky turned amber, Clara came out to the porch with 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed one to him. I didn't know you could garden, she said. I didn't either, he admitted, smiling. Turns out all it takes is slowing down and actually looking at the ground. Clara pressed her lips together, then murmured, The earth doesn't forget who planted it, Eric, whether it was done out of love or out of guilt. He accepted the glass in silence. His hands were tan now, rough with dirt, the same hands that once held pens and stock certificates, now steady on a shovel. He looked down at them, almost startled by how right it felt. A gentle breeze drifted past. In the fading light, Clara looked at him. She didn't speak forgiveness, but the faint curve of her lips, small, fleeting, was like the first sunbeam after rain. Eric lowered his gaze, his voice barely audible above the wind. I want to be worthy of the word father before I ever try to say it. Clara didn't answer. She turned away, but inside her something shifted, something small and fragile, like a seed under the soil, not yet sprouted, but alive. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Clara stepped onto the porch. She found Eric still there, sitting beside the new garden. He held a small oil lantern, the soft glow brushing against his face. Tired but peaceful, no longer the restless man she once knew. You don't have to stay up guarding the garden, she said quietly. I know, he replied, his eyes still on the soil. I just want to see the first sunrise hit it. Maybe I need to grow again too, like those seeds. Clara stood beside him, saying nothing. For that brief, perfect moment, they weren't 2 strangers bound by regret, but 2 souls learning to stand quietly beside each other in a new dawn. Somewhere in the distance a rooster crowed, the soft herald of morning. The sky began to pale, spreading gold across the horizon, and as the first light touched the damp earth, it shone gently on the 3 wooden signs planted in the soil. Lavender, hope, home. Soul Stories fam, if you're watching on another channel, come home to us at Soul Stories, where tens of thousands of listeners and sharers come together. The morning sunlight was warm and gentle, carrying the faint scent of lavender from the new garden they had planted the day before. Eric was teaching little Sam how to tie the irrigation lines, while the twin girls painted wooden signs for the fence. The air was calm, almost perfectly still, as if the world itself was trying to stay quiet. Until the deep growl of an engine broke through the peace. Clara lifted her head. A sleek black Mercedes rolled down the dusty road and stopped in front of the gate. The door opened and a man stepped out, tall, early 40s, in a gray suit and dark sunglasses, with a poise too deliberate to be casual. He didn't need an introduction, but he gave one anyway, extending a card with clinical politeness. Logan Pierce, representing Thorne Industries. Eric froze at the name. Thorne Industries, a giant in real estate, a longtime rival, a name he knew all too well. Logan Pierce had tried to undercut him years ago in New York, a man famous for smiling while closing in on a kill, and now he was standing here, as if the universe had drawn a perfect circle back to his doorstep. Thorne wants to buy this farm, Logan said smoothly, his voice polite but firm. We're offering $5 million. Cash, no conditions. Clara stared at him, stunned. She had never heard a number that large. The farm, once Hale property, abandoned for years, had little commercial worth. I'm sorry, she said, almost whispering. You said $5 million? Logan turned toward her with a faint smile. You must be Clara Whitmore. You live here with your children, yes? But according to the property record, this land is still legally owned by Eric Hale, registered under his name before he left 4 years ago. Clara's stomach twisted. Why are you telling me this? To clarify, Logan said, lowering his sunglasses slightly, his gaze shifting back to Eric, that the decision is his, not yours. The air thickened. The children stopped playing. Even at their age, they could sense something serious had entered the yard. Eric stood motionless for a moment. Once he would have considered selling, would have looked at this place and seen only numbers. But not now. He walked toward the man, slow and steady, the dry wind circling around his boots. And if he says no? Eric's voice was low, quiet, but with an edge that made Logan lift a brow. Logan smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. You should think carefully, Eric. Thorne could turn this forgotten land into a luxury resort, whereas he flicked a glance at Clara, is planting flowers on dead soil. Eric took one step closer, his tone steady. Then that man you just mentioned, says no. Logan tilted his head. That's a shame. I thought you'd forgotten this place. You're right, Eric said, his gaze unwavering. I had, but not anymore. They stood facing each other. Two men from the same ruthless world, only now standing on opposite sides of it. One represented profit and possession. The other, for the first time, stood for something rooted, fragile, and real. At last, Logan tucked his card back into his pocket. You can refuse today, he said calmly. But remember, Hale, the law doesn't side with sentiment. The deed still carries your name. If Thorne wants this land badly enough, we can force a purchase. And he cast another cold glance at Clara, is nothing more than a tenant. Eric's jaw tightened. She's the one who kept this land alive. If anyone deserves to own it, it's her, not me, and certainly not you. Logan's smirk deepened. You sound like a man ready to fight for her. No, Eric said, his voice even quieter now. I'm fighting for what's right. A strong gust of wind swept through, scattering a few lavender petals into the dust. Logan watched him for a moment longer, then gave a faint shrug. We'll see each other again. The Mercedes rolled away, leaving a thin trail of dust curling behind it. Clara didn't move for a long while after the car disappeared. The children clung to her hands. Mommy, who was that man? Grace asked softly. No one important, sweetheart, she said, though her voice trembled just slightly. Eric turned to her and saw the fear she was trying to hide. He knew exactly what she was thinking, and she was right. You shouldn't have done that, she said almost in a whisper. You just made yourself, and this place, a target. Thorne won't let it go. I know. And the land, she went on. Is it true? It's still under your name? Eric nodded slowly. I meant to transfer it to you, but I never got that far. When I left, I thought it wouldn't matter anymore. Her lips tightened, part anger, part helplessness. Then they can use your name against us, Eric. They could take everything. No, Clara. His voice was quiet but certain. Not while I'm here. She looked at him, saying nothing. The air was heavy again, thick with things unspoken. From the porch, the wind carried the smell of wet earth. The fields looked calm, but inside her, another storm was beginning to rise. She glanced toward the little patch of garden, the 3 wooden signs still standing amid the wind and dust. Lavender, hope, home. They trembled, but they stood firm. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara stepped onto the porch. Eric sat on the wooden steps, staring into the darkness of the fields. Do you think they'll come back? She asked. I'm sure of it. And what will you do? I'll talk to my lawyer in Phoenix, he said. We can counter any forced acquisition attempt. But more than that, he turned to her, eyes steady in the dim light. I won't let them scare you again. Clara froze for a moment. There was no grand tone in his words, no empty comfort. Just the voice of a man finally ready to take responsibility. Maybe for the first time in 4 years. Eric, she said softly, this won't be easy. Thorne has money, lawyers, and power we don't. I know. He looked out toward the dark horizon, where the small seedlings were barely visible. But they don't have hope, lavender, or home. Clara followed his gaze. In the darkness, the garden stirred under the whisper of wind, the lavender bending gently. And for the first time, she realized the battle ahead wasn't just about land or property. It was about the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The place and the people that finally felt like home. Chapter 8. The father's name. Approximately 1,000 words. Modern romance style, emotional, warm, and symbolically rich. That morning, the Arizona sky was impossibly blue. The storm had passed, leaving behind wisps of white cloud drifting like silk threads across the horizon. In the yard, the three children chased butterflies, their laughter carried by the breeze like music. Eric stood on the porch, holding three small cream-colored envelopes. Each one had a name written in his slightly unsteady handwriting. Grace, Ellie, Sam. He had spent the whole night writing them. When Clara stepped outside, she noticed something different in him. There was a calmness in his face, but also a gravity that made her fall silent. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "It's time they knew the truth." Her gaze dropped to the letters, her chest tightening. "Are you sure?" He nodded, a faint tremor in his eyes. "They deserve to know who their father is, and I can't live another day pretending they're not mine." Clara took a deep breath, then nodded. "I'll call them." Grace was the first to come running, her braid lopsided, a bit of mud on her cheek. "Mommy, I saw the biggest butterfly ever." Clara smiled softly. "Come here, sweetheart. Mommy and Mr. Eric need to talk to you." "To Dad." The words made Grace pause mid-step. The twins followed, curiosity lighting up their faces as they sat cross-legged on the porch, bare feet dusty from play. Eric knelt down, eye level with them, the three envelopes resting in his hands. For a long moment, he simply looked, memorizing each freckle, each curious stare, each reflection of himself in their eyes. Then he spoke, his voice calm but trembling beneath the weight of it. "You three are the best thing that ever happened to me, even if I was too blind to see it sooner." Grace tilted her head. "What do you mean, Mr. Eric?" He smiled through wet eyes. "I mean, I'm not Mr. Eric. I'm your dad." The world seemed to still. Ellie blinked, confused. Sam's eyes widened in surprise. Only Grace seemed to understand first. "Dad," she whispered, testing the word like it might disappear if she said it too loudly. "You're really staying?" Eric's throat tightened. "As long as you want me to." Grace threw her arms around him. A heartbeat later, Ellie and Sam followed, tiny hands clutching his shirt, warm little bodies pressing close. Eric froze, overwhelmed, then wrapped his arms around all three, holding on as if anchoring himself to something finally real. And then, quietly, he began to cry. Not the tears of guilt, but of belonging. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running, building, or proving. He was home. Clara stood at the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she realized. For 4 years, she had carried everything alone. Mother, father, protector. And now, seeing the man she once loved kneeling there, surrounded by their children, the last walls inside her crumbled. Eric looked up at her, his eyes soft through the tears. "Thank you," he said simply, "for keeping them alive. For keeping me alive, even when you didn't mean to." Clara shook her head, smiling through the wet shimmer in her eyes. "I didn't keep you, Eric." "They did." He smiled back, understanding. "I know." That afternoon, Grace suddenly jumped up with an idea. "Dad, let's build a tree house, our own house, just for us." "A house of your own, huh?" Eric laughed. "What about your mom?" "She can come too," Ellie chimed in, eyes bright. "Of course," Sam added, clutching his sleeve. Clara folded her arms, amused. "Do you even know how to build one?" Eric glanced toward the yard. A large oak tree stood at the center of the garden, strong and tall, branches stretching like open arms. He pointed. "That one. We'll start this afternoon." The rest of the day was filled with the sounds of saws, nails, and laughter. Eric showed Grace how to hold the board steady, Ellie painted the planks, and little Sam guarded the ladder like a proud soldier. Clara sat nearby, sometimes warning him to be careful, sometimes just watching in silence. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, brushing gold across their hair and hands. By sunset, the first wooden frame was up, standing firm beneath the fading light. "We have to name it," Grace said, clapping her hands. "Let's call it the Whitmore Treehouse." Eric paused, surprised. "Why Whitmore?" "Because it's Mommy's name," Grace said matter-of-factly. "And now, it's yours too." Eric froze. Then slowly he smiled. Whitmore Treehouse it is. The words were simple, almost whispered, but to Clara they felt like a vow. For the first time he hadn't said mine. He had said ours. That night, beneath the warm glow of the porch light, they sat together. The children had fallen asleep, heads resting on their mother's lap, the crickets singing somewhere beyond the fence. Eric sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the small garden where the lavender, hope, and home had just begun to sprout. I used to think being a father was a privilege, he said softly. Now I know it's a gift, one you have to earn before you're allowed to keep it. Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable, but the anger that once lived in her eyes was gone. There was only a quiet light, fragile, but real. The night deepened. The stars hung low and close, and out in the field, the little treehouse stood like a promise between them. Imperfect, unfinished, but strong. Because that day, a man reclaimed not his land, not his fortune, but his name, Father, and the family who had waited for it all along. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived from the town post office, sealed with a crimson stamp. Clara assumed it was another routine tax notice, until she tore it open and froze at the heading, Superior Court of Arizona, case number 24-0671, Thorn Industries versus Eric Hale and Clara Whitmore. Alleged corporate asset misappropriation, unauthorized occupation of property. She read it 3 times before the words truly sank in. When she lifted her gaze toward the yard, Eric was outside helping the children paint the barn door, laughing as Sam accidentally smeared green paint across his jeans. The sound of their laughter evaporated the moment Clara stepped out, her face pale. Eric saw the envelope in her hand and took it, scanning the lines quickly, his jaw clenched. They're accusing us of occupying corporate property? Clara's fingers tightened around her sleeve. But you've never worked for them. No, he said quietly. But I used to own the company. They swallowed it whole. That night they sat across from Marianne Frost, Eric's old friend from New York, now a sharp, independent civil attorney with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. Stacks of documents covered the table, rustling like desert wind as she spread them out. Thorne claims that the property listed as Whitmore Farm was recorded under Hale Development's assets before your merger with Iron Gate Holdings, Marianne explained. After that merger, Iron Gate was acquired by Thorne. So legally speaking, they're arguing this land transferred with it. Eric pressed a hand to his forehead. That's impossible. I never included this land in the company's portfolio. Marianne slid a file across the table. Then explain this. A contract, dated 3 days before the merger, with your signature, or rather, one that looks very much like it. Eric looked down. His stomach turned. The signature at the bottom, the subtle curve, the tilt of the H, was his, almost perfectly, too perfectly. This is forged, he said, voice low. Clara gripped his hand. They can just fake something like that? They can try, Marianne replied grimly, and they're counting on you not fighting back. But we will. Do you have anything that proves you never intended this land to be corporate property? Eric was silent for a moment. Then slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled letter, the one he had written to Clara 4 years ago, the one that had never been sent. Marianne unfolded it carefully, reading the faded ink. Her eyes softened. I'm afraid I'm not the man you deserve, so I'm leaving the farm to you. At least you'll have one thing in this world that's yours. Marianne looked up, a faint smile tugging at her lips. This might be our lifeline. It shows that at the time Thorne claims you signed that contract, you were already intent on separating this land from your business assets. If we can authenticate the handwriting and date, it undermines their entire case. She leaned back. But we'll need more. Clara, do you have tax receipts, utility payments, crop invoices? Clara nodded. I've kept everything, every bill, every form. Marianne's grin was small but fierce. Perfect. Then we'll show the court who actually kept this place alive. A week later, at the Maricopa County Courthouse, the air was thick with tension. On the plaintiff's side sat Logan Pierce, immaculately dressed, flanked by 3 corporate lawyers and a stack of binders that looked more like armor than paperwork. On the defense side, only Marianne, Eric, and Clara. When the judge entered, his voice was calm but clipped. Thorn Industries versus Hale and Whitmore. The plaintiff alleges unlawful occupation of company property. Defense? Marianne stood, straight-backed and composed, her white suit stark against the wood panels. Your Honor, the defendants have not occupied company property. They have lived on private land purchased by Mr. Hale with his personal income years before his business merger. We will demonstrate that the document Thorn relies on, claiming to transfer ownership, is a forgery. Furthermore, my clients have paid taxes, maintained and rehabilitated this property for 4 years, during which Thorn Industries has shown no involvement or investment whatsoever. Across the aisle, Logan gave a derisive smirk. We'll prove otherwise, he said smoothly. The judge struck the gavel once. The court will reconvene in 1 week for evidentiary submissions. Both parties are to provide proof of ownership and asset transfer. When the session adjourned, Eric exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest pressing hard. Outside, under the blazing Arizona sun, Clara turned to him. I don't think I've ever seen you that calm. He smiled faintly, a weary, quiet kind of smile. It's not calm, Clara. It's just, this time, I'm not running. That night, after the children were asleep, the house was quiet except for the hum of crickets. Clara sat by the window, watching Eric at the table under the lamplight, sorting receipts, old letters, and photographs into careful piles. For the first time, she didn't see the billionaire or the man who left. She saw someone stripped bare of everything except conviction. He looked up, catching her gaze. If Thorn wants a fight, he said softly, they'll get one. But not just for me, for you, for them. Clara nodded, her voice barely more than a whisper. Then we'll fight. Together. Outside, the desert wind rose again. Not violent this time, but steady, certain. Like the beginning of a new kind of storm. The courtroom was packed to the brim. Reporters filled the aisles, cameras flashing despite the judge's glare. On the front bench sat Grace, Ellie, and Sam beside their babysitter. Small, solemn faces in a sea of adults. Clara and Eric sat side by side at the defense table, hands intertwined under the desk, while Marianne Frost organized her notes, her expression calm but razor-sharp. The bailiff called, "All rise." The judge entered. The trial began. Logan Pierce was the first to stand, his silver tie glinting under the lights. His voice carried across the room, confident and clipped. Your Honor, Thorn Industries lawfully purchased Irongate Holdings, thereby acquiring all assets previously held by Hale Developments. Among those assets was the property known as Whitmore Farm. The defendants have occupied, cultivated, and profited from this land without authorization. Under both federal and Arizona state law, this constitutes unlawful possession of corporate property. He placed a contract on the evidence table, the same one he had flaunted for weeks, its bold signature gleaming at the bottom. This, he said with a practiced flourish, is Mr. Hale's written consent transferring ownership of the property to the corporation. Marianne rose slowly. Her heels clicked once on the tile floor. And this, she said, holding up a folder, is proof that the signature is a forgery. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. She handed over the forensic handwriting report, a meticulous analysis comparing the disputed signature with Eric's verified tax documents from that year. The ink composition, pen pressure, and even the slant of the letter E differ significantly. It is, in short, a fabrication. Logan's jaw tightened. He leaned toward his attorneys, whispering sharply. Marianne stepped forward, her voice gathering strength. Your Honor, Thorn Industries may have papers, money, and an army of lawyers, but they do not have the truth. For 4 years, my client, Clara Whitmore, has lived on this land. She has paid every property tax, repaired every fence, and planted every seed. She did not take this land. She kept it alive when no one else cared. She lifted another file, thick with receipts and faded invoices. These are the tax statements, purchase orders, and crop reports, all in her name. And this, She raised a crumpled, yellowed letter. Is the one thing money cannot buy. The room went still. This letter, Marianne said softly, was written by Eric Hale in 2021, before Hale Developments was ever sold. In it, he wrote, I'm leaving this farm to you so that you and the children will always have somewhere to belong. She turned to the judge, her eyes unwavering. So I ask you, Your Honor, does this sound like a man who would, at the very same time, sign away that land to a faceless corporation? Or does it sound like someone trying to preserve a piece of his humanity before the world took the rest of him? Silence. Even the reporters had stopped typing. Then Marianne laid down one final document. And one more thing, Your Honor. Thorne's own merger report, the original version, not the one they filed publicly. In this document, Whitmore Farm is listed as a non-operational asset, ownership unverified. This version was provided by a former Iron Gate employee, under oath. A murmur of disbelief swept through the room. Logan's composure cracked for the first time. Marianne stepped closer to the bench. I respectfully move that all of Thorne Industries' claims be dismissed and that legal ownership of Whitmore Farm be granted to Eric Hale and Clara. Whitmore, under Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 12-526, and the principle of equitable ownership. Then she paused, her tone softening, her gaze flicking briefly toward Clara and Eric. Because sometimes, Your Honor, ownership isn't just about deeds or contracts. It's about who stayed when everything else left. The judge leaned back, adjusting his glasses. The entire room held its breath. Pages rustled. A clock ticked somewhere in the silence. After what felt like an eternity, he set the files down and spoke, his voice steady and clear. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, this court finds 1. The contract submitted by Thorne Industries contains material inconsistencies and is hereby deemed invalid. 2. Defendant Clara Whitmore has continuously paid property taxes and maintained open, uninterrupted possession of the land for over 4 years. 3. Accordingly, the property known as Whitmore Farm is recognized under joint ownership of Mr. Eric Hale and Ms. Clara Whitmore. The gavel struck once. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing into a swell that filled the entire courtroom. Grace burst into tears and ran into her mother's arms. Ellie followed, clutching Clara's sleeve, while Sam clung to Eric's leg, eyes wide and shining. Eric turned to Clara. His hand found hers, fingers trembling. We did it. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she was smiling through them. No, Eric, she whispered, her voice breaking. We didn't win. He looked at her, puzzled. We just got our home back. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun bathed everything in gold. Reporters called their names, cameras flashed, but Eric and Clara didn't stop. Hand in hand with 3 children skipping beside them, they walked down the courthouse steps. Not as plaintiff and defendant, not as ex-lovers, but as a family that had finally reclaimed what was always theirs. And somewhere in the crowd, Marianne Frost smiled quietly, closing her briefcase. Justice, she murmured, isn't always about the law. Sometimes it's just about coming home. When the old wooden gate creaked open, the familiar scent of damp earth and lavender filled the air. The evening wind of Arizona swept through the yard, carrying the gentle chime of the wind bells Clara had hung years ago. The farm, once the final chapter of their story, was now its beginning. News of their court victory spread faster than the desert wind. By late afternoon, neighbors began arriving with pies, flowers, and tearful smiles. Some came just to shake Clara's hand and say, "We're proud of you." Children darted around the yard wearing paper crowns they had made themselves, scrawled in bright crayon, "Hail Farm Heroes." Grace stood on a crate, declaring proudly, "We're the heroes, but Mommy and Daddy are the superheroes." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Eric bent down and pulled her into his arms, feeling her small heart thump against his chest. A sound he had once feared he'd never hear again. By evening, the last guests had left. The sky was awash in gold and rose. Only the soft rustle of wind and the fading laughter of children remained. Clara leaned against the porch post, watching Eric repair a fallen section of fence. The sunlight traced the lines of his face, the rolled sleeves, the easy steadiness in his movements. She found herself smiling. "You've really changed," she said softly, half to him, half to herself, as if saying it aloud might make it more real. Eric paused and turned toward her. The look in his eyes was calm, not the sharp, distant gleam of a tycoon, but the quiet focus of a man who had weathered a storm and found stillness on the other side. "No," he replied, his voice low but sure. "I just finally became the man I meant to be." The words drifted in the wind, settling deep inside her. The man standing before her was no longer the unreachable billionaire, nor the man who had once walked away. He was simply Eric, a man who had lost everything and learned how to love again. Night fell gently over the farm. Eric built a small fire in the yard. The children gathered around it, roasting marshmallows on sticks while sparks danced up into the dark. The firelight glowed on their faces, on Clara's hair as she sat beside him, her laughter blending with theirs. "Remember this song?" she asked, her eyes glinting with memory. He smiled, nodding. She began to sing softly, her voice trembling with warmth. "This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island." Eric joined in, his deeper tone weaving through hers, and soon all three children were chiming in. Off-key, loud, joyful, their voices carried across the field into the wide-open night. A land that had once felt empty now pulsed with life again. When the song ended, silence settled, the kind that holds peace, not distance. Clara turned her head slightly, watching the flicker of the firelight across his face. She saw something there she hadn't before. Gentleness, not victory. Belonging, not ambition. Later, under a sky strewn with stars, the children dozed off one by one. Grace's head rested on her mother's shoulder, Sam sprawled against his father's leg, and Ellie blinked sleepily at the constellations, refusing to close her eyes until she saw a shooting star. "Eric," Clara murmured, still watching the sky, "what will you do next?" He was quiet for a moment, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. "I'm going to rebuild the company," he said finally, his tone steady but different, stripped of ego. "Not like before. Smaller, real, something that gives back. A company that restores farmland, builds sustainable homes, here in this town." Clara turned to look at him, the flames reflected in her eyes. "Aren't you afraid? After everything that's happened?" He smiled faintly. "Of course. But this time, I have something worth staying for." Her voice softened. "And what's that?" Eric reached out, his hand closing gently around hers, eyes shifting toward the sleeping children. "This family. This land. You." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in years, her heart was completely still. The breeze carried the scent of lavender and warm ash. Out in the distance, beneath the moonlight, the Whitmore treehouse stood tall and proud, its wooden sign glinting faintly in the fire's glow. "Love lives here." Eric gazed at it for a long while, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Funny," he said. "I used to think my empire was the skyscrapers I built in New York. But it turns out, the dirt, the laughter, the people I love, this is the highest place I've ever stood." Clara smiled, the corners of her eyes glistening. "Then you finally built the right thing, Eric. A place to begin again." He looked at her, the warmth of the fire reflecting in his eyes. "Not just to begin again," he said softly, "to finally live." The fire burned low, leaving only embers. In the glow of that last golden light, they sat together. Two hearts once broken, now whole again, surrounded by the soft breathing of their children and the quiet hum of the desert night. A family once lost had finally found its way home. The first sunrise after the storm came softly, like a breath the earth had been holding. Golden light filtered through the beige linen curtains Clara had sewn herself, falling across the wooden floor where Eric's mud-stained boots still stood. Quiet proof of a man who had chosen to stay. Outside, laughter rippled across the fields. "Dad!" The lavender's blooming. Grace's voice rang so loud that the chickens flapped in protest. Eric stepped onto the porch, hair tousled, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. The morning air was cool, laced with the faint perfume of lavender. He followed the children's voices toward the rows of purple swaying gently beneath the sunlight. The blossoms shimmered in waves, spreading all the way to the old fence line. He crouched down, brushed his fingers against a flower, and whispered with a smile, "Because we planted them with love." Clara joined him, carrying another mug. They stood side by side, watching the lavender bloom, the symbol of everything they had fought for. After a moment, she said softly, "I've forgiven you." He turned to her, his expression caught somewhere between awe and relief. Setting his cup aside, he took her hand and murmured, "I don't need the past back. I just need the future. With you." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. In the distance, their children ran around the treehouse, their laughter spilling across the fields. The scent of coffee, lavender, and sunlight mingled into a single perfect stillness. A week later, word spread quietly through town. A new foundation had been formed, the Hale Foundation for Rural Hope. Its mission to support small farmers, rural schools, and single mothers seeking to build sustainable futures. No one knew who funded it. On paper, it was managed by an anonymous board of trustees, but when Marianne Frost visited the farm a few days later, she only smiled knowingly at Eric. "You still haven't lost that habit of changing lives in secret, have you?" He chuckled, gaze drifting toward the open fields. "No one needs to know. As long as something grows somewhere. I used to build cities to prove my worth. Now I just want to help people believe again." Marianne nodded, her smile touched with pride. "Then maybe this, not the skyscrapers, is your real legacy." That afternoon, Eric wore a sun-faded shirt as he and Clara built another fence near the vegetable patch. The air was warm and alive with the buzz of bees. "Who would have thought," Clara teased, "that billionaire Eric Hale would know how to swing a hammer?" Eric grinned, driving a nail into place. "I'm just a man trying to rebuild his home." She paused, watching him. The easy way he laughed now, the steadiness in his hands. "You already have, Eric." By evening, the fields glowed honey gold under the setting sun. The Whitmore treehouse stood finished at last, its wooden beams painted white and blue. A small sign hung proudly from the doorway, painted in uneven, childish strokes. "Love lives here." The children ran around it, hair flying, crumbs of cookies on their faces. "Dad, Ellie, and I are racing to the top," Grace shouted. "And I," Sam declared, puffing his chest, "am the official lavender guardian forever." Eric laughed, sweeping Sam into his arms. "Then you'd better make sure they bloom all year, my little farm hero." Clara watched them, her chest full. When she turned to Eric, her eyes shone with quiet emotion. "You know," she said, "when you left, I thought that was the end of everything. But I was wrong. Some roots don't die. They just wait to be watered again." Eric's voice softened. "And we chose the right soil to plant them in." When night fell, they sat together on the porch. The children slept curled in their mother's lap. Eric wrapped his arm around Clara, drawing her close as the moonlight sifted through the branches, silvering their faces. From the fields came the hum of crickets, the whisper of wind through rows of lavender. Eric's voice broke the quiet, low, thoughtful. "I used to think I belonged to the skyscrapers I built," he said, "but now I know every road I took was just leading me back here." Clara smiled, her voice barely more than a breath. "And home is where someone's waiting for you to return?" He squeezed her hand. "Then I'm never leaving again." The lavender swayed under the stars, their purple hue deepening in the moonlight. The sign on the treehouse flickered softly. "Love lives here," glowing like a heartbeat in the dark.